Let's talk about what's been going on between the United States and Iran, why recent threats and confrontations are dangerous, and why experts, not just critics, think they're likely to fail at achieving their goals. First, it's important to understand that when a leader publicly threatens another nation, especially with military force, people don't just hear the words, they respond to them. So when the U.S. increased military pressure on Iran, issued warnings of further strikes, and underscored that Tehran would be very hard, that wasn't just rhetoric. It was a signal that tensions had reached a level where diplomatic channels were overshadowed by military posturing. Now, here's the first reason many analysts think these threats are likely to fail. The very foundation of the argument that Iran presents an imminent and uncontrollable threat has been questioned. Experts point out that for military action to be justified under U.S. and international law, there normally needs to be clear evidence of an immediate danger. But in many cases, that evidence hasn't been presented publicly or clearly. If the threat doesn't stand up to scrutiny, the rationale for escalation starts to crumble. Second, threats often have the opposite effect of what they're intended to produce. Instead of encouraging a government to negotiate or capitulate, they can galvanize it. That's what seems to be happening in Iran. Rather than moderates gaining influence, hardliners have consolidated power, framing external threats as justification to tighten control and reject outside pressure. That doesn't pave the way for peace, it entrenches conflict. Third, the regional context matters. The Middle East is connected by a web of alliances and rivalries. Escalation between the U.S. and Iran doesn't stay between those two governments. It reverberates across Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and even involving groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis. Breaking that cycle is much harder with guns and bombs than with diplomacy. Evidence already suggests that such escalation has intensified instability rather than resolved it. Fourth, threats can undermine the very negotiations they're supposed to force. World powers and regional intermediaries have been pushing for talks and de-escalation, but when one side issues ultimatums backed by force, it pushes diplomatic channels into the background. Iran has even stated that it's willing to talk, just not under the threat of attacks. And finally, history shows us that military pressure rarely produces long-term solutions alone. In past conflicts, from Vietnam to Iraq, overwhelming force has often been followed by prolonged insurgencies, chaos, and unintended blowback. So when leaders frame threats as a quick fix, the reality on the ground rarely matches that narrative. So what does all of this mean? It means that threats, especially without solid justification or a clear diplomatic pathway, are risky and unpredictable. They tend to harden attitudes rather than soften them, rallying opponents instead of splitting them. They complicate negotiations rather than simplifying them, and they raise the specter of wider conflict rather than ushering in peace. If the goal is stability, experts argue that credible diplomacy backed by international cooperation and sensible negotiation is far more likely to succeed than unilateral threats alone. Otherwise, we risk trading one cycle of violence for another without solving the problems that brought us here in the first place. And that fundamentally is why these threats are so dangerous and why they are likely to fail. When we talk about the escalation of conflict between the United States and Iran, it's crucial to recognize that this is not a sudden development, but the result of a long series of actions, reactions, and rhetoric that have gradually raised tensions to unprecedented levels. The recent threats and statements coming from the U.S. leadership, including warnings of military strikes and public assertions that Iran would face severe consequences if it continued certain activities, have made the situation highly volatile. These announcements are more than just words, they are signals to both domestic and international audiences that the U.S. is prepared to act decisively, even unilaterally, in ways that could reshape regional stability. Escalation, in this sense, is not simply about one-off incidents or isolated attacks, but about creating a climate of sustained pressure that communicates the possibility of rapid and severe military action. This approach relies heavily on signaling strength, intending to deter perceived aggression, but it also inherently increases the risk of miscalculation, because it puts both governments on high alert and reduces the margin for diplomatic maneuvering. The military maneuvers and deployments that accompany these threats are part of a strategy designed to reinforce credibility. When aircraft carriers, strategic missile systems, and additional troops are positioned in proximity to Iran, it serves as both a tangible and psychological demonstration of power. Observers both inside and outside the United States interpret these movements in different ways. For allies, they may appear as reassurance that the U.S. is committed to defending its interests and maintaining regional stability. For adversaries, they may be perceived as aggressive posturing or even as a precursor to preemptive strikes, which naturally triggers defensive preparations. This dynamic creates a feedback loop in which each side feels compelled to act not only to deter the other, but also to maintain domestic and international credibility, which can inadvertently make an actual confrontation more likely. Public rhetoric, particularly in high-profile media and social media platforms, amplifies this escalation. By issuing strong, attention-grabbing statements about Iran's alleged threats or the consequences of inaction, the U.S. leadership is aiming to shape public perception and signal resolve. These statements are intended to reassure domestic audiences that the government is taking threats seriously while simultaneously sending a message to Iran that any aggressive action will be met with a forceful response. The challenge, however, is that public declarations often limit flexibility. Once a threat is made in a highly visible forum, reversing course or engaging in behind-the-scenes diplomacy becomes more politically complicated because it can be framed as weakness. This dynamic can intensify the sense of escalation and urgency, both for policymakers and for the military apparatus on the ground, making missteps or misunderstandings more consequential. Historical context also matters in evaluating this escalation. Past incidents between the U.S. and Iran, such as the targeting of nuclear facilities, proxy conflicts in the region, and economic sanctions, have already laid the groundwork for heightened tensions. Each new threat or military action builds on previous ones, creating a cumulative effect where even small actions are interpreted as potentially significant escalations. This compounding effect is particularly pronounced in regions like the Persian Gulf, where multiple actors, including allied states and proxy groups, are closely watching developments. Any perceived aggression by one party can trigger rapid responses from multiple sides, further entrenching the cycle of escalation. Analysts point out that such patterns have historically increased the likelihood of unintended consequences, as local actors may take preemptive or retaliatory measures in anticipation of broader conflict. Another dimension to this escalation is the international diplomatic environment. While the U.S. projects strength through military presence and rhetoric, it also faces pressure from allies and international organizations advocating for restraint and negotiation. This creates a complex situation in which the U.S. must balance its demonstration of resolve with the need to avoid isolating itself diplomatically. Heightened threats can undermine ongoing diplomatic channels, making it more difficult for mediators to facilitate de-escalation. When multiple actors with differing priorities and perceptions are involved, the risk of miscommunication or misinterpretation grows, which further contributes to the escalation dynamic. When examining Iran's response to U.S. threats, it becomes clear that the nation has consistently framed these actions as aggressive and provocative, positioning itself not as the initiator of conflict, but as a country defending its sovereignty and regional interests. From the perspective of Tehran, the repeated military maneuvers, sanctions, and public threats from the United States represent attempts to coerce Iran into compliance with foreign demands, particularly regarding its nuclear program and regional policies. Iranian officials have often emphasized that any external threat will be met with measured but firm resistance, signaling to both domestic and international audiences that they are prepared to protect their nation and assert their strategic autonomy. This framing serves multiple purposes. It reinforces internal unity, deters adversaries from taking rash actions, and communicates to the world that Iran perceives itself as a legitimate and capable actor in regional and global politics. Part of Iran's response is rooted in a long-standing narrative of resilience and self-reliance that has been cultivated over decades of sanctions, military pressure, and diplomatic isolation. Iranian leadership frequently highlights historical examples where the country withstood external pressure, portraying threats as opportunities to demonstrate strength rather than as vulnerabilities. This narrative resonates with the Iranian public, helping to maintain domestic legitimacy and support for the government's foreign policy stance. By presenting themselves as defenders of the nation against foreign intimidation, Iranian officials can rally nationalist sentiment and create a sense of unity in the face of what they describe as coercive or hostile actions. In this context, the response to U.S. threats is as much about shaping public perception as it is about actual military or strategic moves. Iran's reaction is also characterized by a strategic calculation aimed at avoiding direct conflict while maintaining deterrence. Rather than engaging in immediate retaliation, the government often responds with carefully measured statements, symbolic military actions, or demonstrations of capability that signal readiness without crossing thresholds that would trigger full-scale confrontation. For example, Iran has conducted military exercises, deployed missile systems, and showcased its regional influence in proxy networks to indicate that it can retaliate if necessary, while leaving room for diplomacy and negotiation. This dual approach allows Iran to maintain credibility as a regional power and to manage risk in an environment where miscalculations could escalate into broader conflict, which would be costly for both sides. The response is also heavily influenced by Iran's view of international support and alliances. Tehran has historically sought to counterbalance U.S. pressure by strengthening relations with regional and global partners, leveraging diplomatic channels and strategic partnerships to reinforce its position. This approach involves engaging with countries that may mediate or apply pressure on the United States to avoid military escalation, as well as cultivating relationships that enhance Iran's regional influence. By signaling that it is not isolated, Iran creates a more complex strategic environment for the U.S., complicating any calculations about the efficacy or consequences of threats. This network of alliances and partnerships is a key factor in why Iranian leadership often feels confident in resisting coercive actions. Furthermore, Iran's response is deeply shaped by its internal political dynamics. Different factions within the Iranian government, including hardliners and moderates, interpret threats and opportunities in distinct ways. Hardline elements often advocate for a stronger posture, emphasizing self-defense, national pride, and deterrence. Moderates may favor cautious engagement and limited cooperation with international actors to reduce pressure. The interplay between these factions informs the nature of Iran's official statements, military exercises, and regional activities. By calibrating its responses to project strength while leaving room for negotiation, Iran demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of both domestic expectations and the strategic environment, signaling that it will not be easily intimidated. One of the most critical aspects to understand about recent U.S. threats against Iran is that many experts and analysts argue there is a significant lack of clear justification for these actions. When a country claims that another nation poses an imminent threat, especially one that could warrant military intervention, there is an expectation in international law and diplomatic practice that the evidence supporting that claim will be credible, verifiable, and presented in a way that allows the global community to assess its validity. In the case of Iran, many of the assertions made regarding immediate danger, whether related to nuclear development, regional proxy activity, or alleged attacks on U.S. interests, have either been vague, uncorroborated, or heavily classified, leaving the public and even some allied governments uncertain about the exact rationale for heightened threats. This lack of transparency opens the door for criticism, skepticism, and, in some cases, the perception that the actions are driven more by political objectives than by an objectively imminent threat. This ambiguity becomes particularly problematic because it affects not only international perception, but also domestic credibility. Policymakers and commentators often point out that when evidence is not presented publicly or when it is framed in ways that are difficult to evaluate independently, it undermines trust. Citizens, journalists, and even allied governments may question whether the threat truly exists at the level being claimed or whether the rhetoric is intended to serve strategic or political purposes, such as rallying domestic support, influencing elections, or demonstrating strength in international negotiations. This is significant because without a clear and widely accepted justification, the risk of miscalculation increases. Opponents may interpret the actions as overreach, while domestic audiences may become divided over whether escalation is warranted. Additionally, historical precedents reinforce the importance of credible justification. Previous conflicts that were justified on the basis of imminent threats, such as the 2003 invasion of Iraq, demonstrated the long-term consequences of acting on claims that later proved to be exaggerated or unsupported. Such precedents have made both policymakers and analysts particularly cautious when evaluating new claims of imminent danger. In the case of Iran, critics argue that many of the U.S. assertions resemble patterns from past conflicts, including selective intelligence presentation, emphasis on worst-case scenarios, and reliance on hypothetical outcomes rather than documented actions. This approach complicates both domestic and international support for aggressive measures as it requires trust in the accuracy and interpretation of intelligence that is often opaque or disputed. The lack of clear justification also interacts with diplomatic efforts in complex ways. When the rationale for threats is ambiguous, it makes it more difficult for neutral or allied countries to act as mediators. Diplomats often rely on verified facts to guide negotiations, encourage restraint, or facilitate compromise. When those facts are unclear, negotiations stall, and the opportunity to resolve disputes peacefully diminishes. This ambiguity can therefore exacerbate tensions rather than reduce them, as Iran and other regional actors interpret unilateral threats without transparent evidence as signals of potential aggression rather than invitations for dialogue. Another factor to consider is the role of public perception in shaping the response. In democratic societies, public support or opposition to foreign policy decisions often depends on whether people believe the actions are justified. Without clear evidence that a threat is imminent or real, citizens may question why military pressure or escalatory rhetoric is necessary. This skepticism can create political pressure on leaders to either provide more convincing evidence or reconsider their approach, which may, in turn, influence the way threats are communicated and executed. The perception of legitimacy is therefore as important as the underlying facts in determining the effectiveness of foreign policy measures. The ambiguity surrounding the justification of these threats has strategic consequences on the ground. When Iran perceives that claims of imminent threat are exaggerated or politically motivated, it may embolden the government to resist or counteract these actions rather than comply, further reducing the likelihood that threats alone will achieve the desired outcomes. At the same time, international actors observing the situation are forced to make calculations based on incomplete information, which increases the risk of misinterpretation and accidental escalation, making the absence of clear justification a central factor in the ongoing tensions. Another major factor to understand in this situation is the broader regional impact that rising tensions between the United States and Iran can create. The Middle East is one of the most interconnected and politically complex regions in the world, where conflicts rarely remain limited to just two countries. When two major actors like the United States and Iran move toward confrontation, the consequences quickly extend far beyond their borders, affecting neighboring states, regional alliances, and various non-state groups that operate across the region. Because of this network of relationships and rivalries, even small escalations between Washington and Tehran can ripple outward and influence the stability of multiple countries at the same time. Iran plays a significant role in regional politics through a combination of diplomacy, economic ties, and strategic partnerships with various political and military groups in countries such as Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Over the years, Iran has developed influence in these areas partly as a response to external pressure and partly as a strategy to protect its own security interests. When the United States threatens military action or increases pressure on Iran, these networks naturally become part of the larger equation. Groups that are politically or ideologically aligned with Iran may interpret U.S. threats as attacks on their broader alliance, which can lead to increased tensions in several locations simultaneously. This interconnected structure creates a situation where a single confrontation could quickly evolve into a wider regional crisis. For example, if hostilities were to escalate in the Persian Gulf, shipping lanes that are vital to global energy markets could become unstable. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important maritime routes for oil transportation, sits directly between Iran and several Gulf countries. Any disruption in this area could affect global energy supplies, international markets, and the economic stability of countries that rely heavily on oil imports. Because of this, many governments around the world closely monitor tensions between the United States and Iran, knowing that the consequences could extend far beyond the immediate region. Another layer of complexity comes from the presence of U.S. allies and military bases throughout the Middle East. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others host American military facilities or maintain strong defense partnerships with Washington. In a scenario where the United States and Iran enter a period of intense confrontation, these locations could become strategic targets or areas of heightened military activity, even if these countries do not directly participate in a conflict. Their proximity to key military infrastructure makes them vulnerable to becoming involved indirectly. The regional political balance also plays a role in shaping how tensions unfold. Rivalries between major Middle Eastern powers already create a fragile environment where alliances shift and competition for influence is constant. Escalation between the United States and Iran can intensify these rivalries, pushing countries to take sides or strengthen their own military positions. This can result in an arms buildup, increased military exercises, and heightened political rhetoric across the region. Each of these reactions adds another layer of instability and raises the risk that a localized incident could trigger broader confrontations. In addition to government-level tensions, the broader populations in the region are also affected by these developments. Economic uncertainty, fear of military conflict, and disruptions to trade can influence everyday life in countries across the Middle East. Tourism declines, investment slows, and markets react quickly to any sign that a conflict could break out. These social and economic pressures can influence political decision-making within regional governments, further complicating efforts to reduce tensions. Because of all these interconnected factors, analysts often emphasize that threats or military pressure directed at Iran do not exist in isolation. They interact with a much larger regional system that includes alliances, economic interests, and long-standing political rivalries. When leaders consider the consequences of escalating rhetoric or military action, they must account for how those decisions might influence not just bilateral relations, but the stability of an entire region where multiple actors are constantly watching, reacting, and adjusting their own strategies in response to shifting power dynamics. Another important element in understanding why strong threats against Iran may not achieve their intended results is the impact those threats can have on Iran's internal leadership dynamics. Political pressure from outside a country often produces unexpected consequences inside that country, especially when national identity, sovereignty, and security are involved. In Iran's case, external pressure, whether in the form of sanctions, military threats, or aggressive rhetoric, has historically shaped the balance of power between different political factions within the country. Instead of weakening the government or encouraging internal political change, such pressure often strengthens the more hardline voices that argue the country must resist outside influence at all costs. Iran's political system is complex and includes multiple centers of power, such as the presidency, the parliament, the military establishment, and the religious leadership that holds significant authority over the direction of the state. Within this system, there are often debates about how Iran should engage with the outside world. Some leaders and political groups favor cautious diplomacy and gradual engagement with international institutions. Others believe that foreign powers cannot be trusted and that Iran must rely primarily on self-sufficiency and strong defense capabilities. When external threats become more visible or more aggressive, it tends to shift public and political support toward the factions that emphasize resistance and national strength. This dynamic occurs partly because threats from abroad can unify public opinion around the idea of defending national sovereignty. Citizens who might otherwise disagree with certain government policies may still feel compelled to support their country when they perceive that it is under external pressure. Leaders who advocate a firm response can therefore gain more influence because their message resonates with the population's desire for security and independence. In this way, aggressive rhetoric from outside actors can unintentionally reinforce the very leadership structures that those threats were meant to weaken. Another aspect of this leadership dynamic involves how governments frame external pressure within their domestic narratives. Iranian officials frequently present sanctions and military threats as evidence that foreign powers are attempting to undermine the country's independence. By framing the situation in this way, they can strengthen nationalist sentiment and encourage citizens to view resistance as a patriotic duty. This narrative becomes particularly powerful when threats are communicated publicly and repeatedly, because it provides visible examples that leaders can point to as proof of foreign hostility. This environment can also make diplomatic compromise more difficult for Iranian leaders. When tensions rise and public expectations shift toward resistance, political figures who might otherwise consider negotiation may fear appearing weak or compromising national dignity. Even if diplomatic solutions are available, the internal political cost of pursuing them becomes higher when the country feels under siege. As a result, external pressure can narrow the range of options available to policymakers within Iran, making confrontation more likely than cooperation. In addition, institutions such as the military and security forces tend to gain greater influence during periods of heightened tension. Governments facing external threats often allocate more resources to defense, intelligence, and strategic planning. In Iran, organizations responsible for national defense can become more prominent in shaping policy when the country perceives itself to be under threat. This shift in influence can reinforce a security-focused approach to foreign policy where deterrence and strategic resilience take priority over diplomatic engagement. Observers who study international relations often note that these types of internal political shifts are not unique to Iran. Many countries throughout history have experienced similar patterns where outside pressure strengthens national unity and consolidates power among leaders who advocate strong resistance. When threats are intended to force quick political change, they sometimes produce the opposite result by solidifying the existing leadership and reducing the likelihood of internal reform. In the case of Iran, repeated external pressure has contributed to a political environment in which resilience and self-reliance are emphasized as core national values, shaping how leaders and institutions respond to foreign policy challenges and influencing the overall trajectory of the country's decision-making process in times of heightened international tension. Another crucial dimension of this issue is how aggressive threats and confrontational rhetoric can undermine diplomacy. International diplomacy is built on communication, negotiation, and a certain level of trust between governments. Even when those governments strongly disagree with one another, when public threats become the dominant tool of foreign policy, the space for negotiation often becomes much smaller. This is because diplomacy usually requires both sides to feel that compromise is possible without losing face or appearing weak in front of their domestic audiences. When leaders publicly issue warnings of punishment, military action, or severe consequences, it can make it politically difficult for the other side to enter negotiations without appearing to surrender under pressure. Diplomatic processes are often slow and complex because they involve balancing national interests, domestic politics, and international expectations. When tensions rise between two countries like the United States and Iran, mediators and international organizations frequently attempt to open channels for dialogue. These channels can involve direct negotiations, back-channel communication through diplomats, or mediation by neutral countries that maintain relationships with both sides. However, when one side repeatedly emphasizes threats or military options, it can create an environment where diplomatic initiatives struggle to gain traction. Negotiators on the opposing side may become skeptical about whether talks are genuine or simply a tactic to gain strategic advantage. Public perception also plays a powerful role in shaping diplomatic possibilities. Leaders must consider how their citizens will react to negotiations with a rival country. If a population is constantly hearing messages that portray the other side as dangerous, hostile, or untrustworthy, public support for compromise becomes more difficult to build. This is especially true when media coverage amplifies confrontational statements and focuses on worst-case scenarios. Over time, this environment can harden attitudes on both sides, making diplomatic engagement appear risky or politically unpopular. Another factor that complicates diplomacy is the role of international alliances. The United States and Iran each have partners and allies that influence their strategic decisions. When threats are made publicly, those allies may feel pressure to respond, either by supporting the rhetoric or by preparing their own defensive measures. This can create a chain reaction where multiple countries become involved in the tension, even if they originally preferred a diplomatic approach. Once several actors are engaged in the situation, reaching a negotiated settlement becomes more complicated because the interests and concerns of additional parties must be considered. Economic pressure is often used alongside threats as part of a strategy intended to force policy changes. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial limitations are designed to create economic hardship that encourages a government to reconsider its actions. However, when these measures are combined with aggressive rhetoric, the targeted country may interpret them as part of a broader attempt to weaken or destabilize its leadership. In response, that country may become less willing to engage in negotiations, believing that concessions will only invite further pressure. This can transform what might have been a bargaining process into a prolonged standoff. Diplomacy also depends heavily on timing and mutual signals. When governments send mixed messages, sometimes suggesting negotiation, while at other times emphasizing threats, it can create confusion about their true intentions. The opposing side may question whether negotiations are sincere or whether they are simply a temporary pause before more pressure is applied. This uncertainty can slow down diplomatic progress and increase the risk that misunderstandings will escalate into more serious confrontations. Historical examples in international relations demonstrate that sustained diplomacy often requires patience, consistency, and a willingness to engage even with adversaries. When threats dominate the conversation, those diplomatic principles can become overshadowed by short-term political calculations or displays of strength. In such an environment, negotiations may stall, communication channels may weaken, and opportunities for compromise may gradually disappear as both sides focus more on demonstrating resolve than on exploring solutions that could reduce tensions and create a pathway toward long-term stability. When you step back and look at the entire situation, one thing becomes very clear: threats alone rarely solve complex geopolitical problems. The tensions between the United States and Iran are rooted in decades of mistrust, regional competition, political ideology, and security concerns that cannot simply be erased through warnings or military pressure. History consistently shows that when powerful nations rely primarily on intimidation, it often produces resistance instead of compliance. Countries facing external pressure tend to strengthen their internal unity, reinforce defensive strategies, and seek new alliances rather than surrender their national interests. In the case of the United States, under Donald Trump and the government of Ali Khamenei, the escalating rhetoric highlights how easily political messaging can push two nations further apart instead of bringing them closer to resolution. Military threats can raise tensions across the Middle East, influence domestic politics inside Iran, and weaken diplomatic channels that might otherwise offer peaceful solutions. When leaders rely on strong language without a clear pathway toward negotiation, the result is often a cycle of reaction and counter-reaction that makes stability even harder to achieve. Real and lasting solutions in international conflicts usually come from sustained diplomacy, careful negotiation, and cooperation with the global community. Pressure and deterrence may sometimes play a role, but without credible dialogue, they rarely produce the long-term outcomes policymakers hope for. As many analysts point out, stability in the Middle East depends not only on power, but also on communication, trust building, and strategic patience. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why many experts believe that aggressive threats against Iran are unlikely to succeed in achieving their intended goals. Instead of forcing quick change, they risk deepening divisions, strengthening hardline positions, and prolonging the very conflict they are meant to resolve. In the end, the path toward lasting stability is far more likely to come from diplomacy and balanced engagement than from escalating rhetoric and confrontation.